So hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our ES&M Symposium, the London Classification, Diagnostic Testing of Anorectal Function, State of the Art in 2021. And we're going to start with an exciting trip to the past and to the future to see how the London Classification of Anorectal Disorders was conceived, what it does to the field of anorectal function testing. Does it move the field forward? Does it have any gaps? Do we need to work more? And what are further working points to improve on the work that we've already done? And I'm also very pleased to welcome lots of friendly faces as speakers, friends, colleagues from all over the world. It's going to be Mark Fox from Switzerland, Emma Carrington from London, UK, Anton Emmanuel also from London, and François Millon from France, talking about these topics. And in the end, Charlie Knowles, also from London, will wrap up the discussion with you all. So I'm very pleased to see you all. So for the first talk in our series, I want to welcome Mark Fox from Switzerland to tell us about the long road from Chicago to London and how the consensus classification for diagnosis of disorders of anorectal function was conceived and how all that worked. Over to you, Mark.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to kick off this symposium with some background information about how we developed the consensus classification for diagnosis of disorders of anorectal function. This was informed by my experience of working on the Chicago classification of esophageal dysmotility, the Lyon classification of reflux disease, as chair of the International Working Group for Disorders of GI Motility and Function. It is clear to all of us in the field that functional GI symptoms can develop from the moment we take food into our mouths to the moment that we go to the toilet. It is also clear to us that endoscopy and radiology, although essential to exclude organic disease, do not provide sufficient insight into the causes of symptoms and disease in the majority of individuals that we test. We need an exercise test for the GI tract, relevant to whichever part of that process we're looking at, whether it's the esophagus or the anorectum. Because what we really need to do here is to understand the pathophysiological basis of abnormal function, of symptoms, of disorders of brain-gut interaction. A challenging thing to do, but something that involves at least 60 to 70% of all the patients in our clinics. Because what we aim to achieve is a meaningful explanation of patient condition, something that helps us target rational and effective management. When I was starting in the field, esophageal high-resolution manometry was just in the process of being developed. Work by Don Castel, by Radu Tutrian, had made it clear to us that motility alone, manometry measurements alone, did not fully explain what was going on. It was really only when motility led to abnormal function that symptoms commonly occurred. And for the esophagus, when transport of the food to the mouth, from the mouth to the stomach was interrupted, or when the esophagus failed to prevent reflux. This is key, because at the time, the classification of esophageal motility disorders was essentially descriptive and very much focused on pressure measurements. But it had been clear for a while that these diagnoses were subjective, based as much on clinical presentation as pressure recordings. We needed more and more clinically relevant data. And as so often in medicine, what gave us an in here was technology. The progress of technology has driven progress in this field to a great extent, moving from conventional manometry with just a few pressure traces to high-resolution manometry with multiple traces, to the development of topographic so-called Klaus plots, which provide a visually appealing representation of esophageal function from the pharynx to the stomach over time. I was aided in this by my friends and colleagues, John Pandolfino, Arjen Bredenor. We founded the HRM working group in 2007. We went back to our bosses and got them involved. And this led quickly to the Chicago Classification version 1 in 2009, which has been improved on in 3 iterative steps with publication of version 4 in 2021. What we learned during this period of time was a lot on how people worked and how to bring people together. First of all, studies reported remarkable variability in the performance, interpretation, and reporting of almost all physiological investigations that we have looked at. So it was essential that we got an expert group together that represented this diverse range of opinion, various viewpoints, ideally from all over the world, from various professional organizations which had an interest in this technology. We also felt it was important to keep observers from all key manufacturers involved, because what's the point of developing something like this if you can't apply it in the technology, in the reporting programs? What we learned very clearly was that agreeing terminology and operating procedures early on was key to the success of any process like this. We adhered closer and closer to validated processes used also in other fields of medicine, where questions were formulated, the quality of evidence graded, strength of recommendation assessed, before we got to a consensus guideline. So we were attempting to bring as much information into this process as possible and then come up with an integrated, unified view. And it was also very clear that we had also to accept that no one investigation, whether manometry or pH or measurements or whatever, no one measurement is a gold standard. And so we have to integrate all the information that we have available before we come up with a consensus guideline. And even at the off, we have to expect that future iterations will be necessary. In the Chicago Classification of Esophageal Motor Disorders, we decided that we were only going to use objective metrics validated against gastrointestinal function. So in this case, bolus transport, reflux protection. And that we were going to refine this in the later iterations with the results of clinical outcome studies. And this process was done at the Ascona meetings, which I chaired in 2009 and 2015. We also agreed that we were going to use a hierarchical classification based on physiological principles. So in the case of the esophagus, if the esophagogastric junction, the lower esophageal sphincter, if you like, is not working, then quite frankly, it doesn't matter very much what the peristaltic function of the esophagus is like. This esophagus is not going to work. And when it did work, the only motility disorders that we were truly interested in were things that were generally not seen in health. Everything else was too diffuse. This field was confusing enough. We did not want to put in minor motility disorders, which we couldn't really interpret, where we couldn't be certain that they were clinically relevant. And so, if borderline cases were present, rather than just calling them minor motility disorders, we insisted that there was confirmation of the clinical relevance of the findings from additional data, whether that was from symptom association, from imaging like esophageal swallows, endoflip, or other technology that has become available more recently. And this here is the current version of the Chicago Classification. Again, a hierarchical organization with disorders of esophagogastric junction at the top, disorders of peristalsis at the bottom, but now understanding more clearly that when inconclusive findings are present, that we needed to confirm with additional tests. So this was the experience that we brought to bear. Together with that gathered, developing the Lyon classification for gastroesophageal reflux disease, which is a more complicated disorder, which definitely needs more than one form of investigation to diagnose clearly. This was the experience that we brought to bear at the London classification of anorectal motility and function. Defecation and continence are very complex processes. To be fully continent, to defecate normally, you need to be able to sense rectal filling when you need to sense that something's there. You need to then increase abdominal pressure if you want to go to the toilet. You need to relax and open the sphincter, evacuate completely, and then reclose the sphincter and maintain closure over time. In this sense, Anton Emmanuel has said, this is like a tube of toothpaste. You've got to know it's full. You've got to squeeze it, got to take the lid off, and afterwards put the lid back on if you don't want to have toothpaste all over your bathroom cabinet. Trivial perhaps, but for the anorectal disorders, very important. Again here, technology drove progress. The ability to visualize anorectal function continually over time, despite the movement of the anorectum with pelvic floor descent and other issues. This really helped us get a clear visualization of what was going on down below. Particularly during defecation, there's often important shifts in catheter location that were not noticed that can easily lead to false negative results. Again, similar to the Chicago classification, various researchers validated the metrics used against imaging tests such as defecography, showing that there is a clear correlation between findings, let's say, of dysynergic defecation with paradoxical contraction of the sphincter in the manometry trace to the findings that we find during magnetic resonance defecography. Here, examples during dysynergic defecation and during pelvic descent. Again, a lot of people were involved. Emma Carrington, Henrietta Heinrich, who we've heard from already or will hear from very shortly, Mark Scott, Charlie Knowles from the London group, and our friends in America, Satish Rao, Adil Baruka, and Bill Whitehead. This was a long-term process. It took 3 or 4 years to complete, but we're very pleased with the final outcome. Again, agreeing a process was terribly important. Once we'd agreed what to call everything and how to perform the tests, everything came together quite quickly. This sequence of investigations requires more than just manometry, but also a test of evacuation performed in almost all patients to confirm the clinical relevance of what we've just seen in the pressure measurements, because there are still some disagreements about how to interpret the findings. And also, as before, an understanding that in some cases it will be important to confirm results using imaging. Again, there's a hierarchical approach. We begin with disorders of rectoanal inhibitory function. Well, these are of course rare. Hirschsprung's disease in adults is an extremely unusual condition, but if it's present, that's a major motility disorder that requires immediate attention. There are disorders of tone and contractility, disorders of rectoanal coordination, which certainly require confirmation if present with balloon expulsion tests or defecography. And then there are additional measurements of rectal sensation, which are very important for many people with chronic constipation or fecal incontinence. But we achieved this. It took 4 years, but we achieved consensus of diagnostic classification for disorders of anorectal function. And unlike the esophageal area and reflux areas, this was the very first time that this had ever been achieved in this field. We've published our work in a series of review articles and consensus statements. And we really feel that we have achieved some progress here, moving from a description of anorectal function to a diagnostic classification, which helps us understand the underlying causes of constipation, incontinence, obstructive defecation, that does indeed provide a meaningful explanation of symptoms and may help us target rational and effective management. This is version 1. We're just at the beginning of this process, but I hope you will join us in Ascona next year to discuss how the impact of this classification on clinical practice and how we can build on this foundation and move forward to improve care for our patients. Many thanks for your attention.